All right. I think that might have to be the start of the episode.
I think so.
Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fucked up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Welcome once again to Occulte Veritatis podcast. I'm Ood Gallifrey, and in live recording with me,
Sage Murray,
Leon Filger,
Richard Bigley,
The Soundboard Demon,
Don Kessler,
and Tori.
Today we're going to be talking about arguably the worst race massacre in American history that was almost erased from the history books deliberately. But to talk about that, we probably need some poison.
My poison's half gone.
So, what's your poison?
What's our poison, everyone?
Alrighty, so to continue with our cannabis recording episodes, we are eating an edible. Our house weed has been processed into butter, and that butter has been processed into caramels. So we're going to take a chunk of that. We're going to review the taste now and the feeling at the end of the episode.
It's very fucking good.
Mine had like a bunch of little grains of salt on it, so you got that salt caramel thing going on. This is my second one, actually, so I don't know. Maybe I'm taking my life into my own hands here or not. I don't know.
Very chewy, very good.
On our theme of space-based podcasts here.
Ovpod hosts go to space.
Yeah, it's
go
like
to the fucking moon.
Yeah, it's. I like it. It's like caramel and salt and like that little hint of like cannabis to it, you know?
I'm eating mine with apples, and it's very good.
I'd give the taste like an 8 out of 10. It was a good combination of caramel and marijuana.
I'd give the taste like a 9.5 out of 10. This is so good.
I'll go to a 10 out of 10. It's exactly what I was hoping for. Hit the spot, and now I have 2 of them in me, so we'll see what happens.
I had none of them because I have to go play with my son after this.
I can't really say on the taste. Don't worry, it's not COVID. It's something else. But the texture is perfectly caramelly. Like I even felt the grain of sand on top, and just a perfect little reminder that it's a salted caramel, and it even brings that image of the salted caramel flavor back to my mind. 10 out of 10.
Before we hop in the episode, I would like everyone to go around and say their word for what kind of candy that was. Just the one word that starts with a C. Ood?
Caramel?
Caramel?
Caramel.
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 I don't remember what I said. Is it hitting already?
No, what the fuck would you call it?
Caramel?
Everyone says caramel or caramel differently, and I was curious. Caramel on.
It's because I got that Canadian rise, eh?
Yeah.
My name is Viola Ford Fletcher. I'm a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. On May 31st in 21, I went to bed in my family's home in Greenwood, neighbors of Tulsa. The neighborhood I felt asleep in that night was rich, not just in terms of wealth, but in culture, community, heritage, and my family had a beautiful home. We had great neighbors, and I had friends to play with. I felt safe. I had everything a child could need. I had a bright future ahead of me. Within a few hours, all of that was gone. The night of the massacre, I was awakened by my family. My parents and 5 siblings were there. I was told we had to leave, and that was it. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not, and our descendants do not. When my family was forced to leave Tulsa, I lost my chance of an education. I never finished school past the 4th grade. I have never made much money in my country. We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented all the best of what was possible for black people in America and for all the people. No one cared about us for almost 100 years. We and our history have been forgotten, washed away. This Congress must recognize us and our history.
Alrighty, so today we're talking about Black Wall Street, also known as the Tulsa Race Massacre. One of the biggest massacres in American history, and really I was surprised at the events that led up and how silly they were. I'm going to dive into that, but first let's go into, I guess, a little bit of background on the American slave trade. So in 1619, about 20 or so slaves were brought over to America at the start of the U.S. African slave trade. By the mid-1700s, over 300,000, 13% of the entire U.S. population was made of African slaves or people who directly descended from African slaves. While slavery was active and legal in America, an approximated $18 trillion worth of free labor was extracted from about 12.5 million slaves.
That's fucking gross.
Oh, yeah. And imagine if your country just got $18 million worth of free labor they could use to build infrastructure and build roads. When people say America was built on the back of slaves, it's a very literal thing.
Mm-hmm.
In 1865, the American Civil War was fought over quote-unquote states' rights, but really more about the ability for those states to keep slaves. The North won, and 3 years later, in 1868, the slaves were freed. But the American attitude towards African Americans did not rapidly change. In fact, even today, there's a lot of prejudice in America. I'm sure not shocking anybody by saying that. And back then, after the slaves were freed, the majority of Americans still did not care for black. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, an environment of racism, which included segregation, lynching, extrajudicial justice, and entire corrupt groups of people taking it upon themselves to put black people in their place, was alive. Now, in most places in the 1920s, segregation was the rule of the land. Separate water fountains, separate bus seats, and further separate opportunities. Bank loans or jobs or deals made with black people were often different in a worse way than deals made with white people. You could be murdered by just being black at the wrong place at the wrong time, and often all it took to land you in jail was an accusation from somebody without any real proof.
Sounds pretty modern.
Yeah, a lot of this sounds very familiar, and it was a lot of the same problems exist today, like in a less overt form, but still very much around. And in this environment of segregation, the Greenwood District in Tulsa emerged. Basically, in the turn of the 1900s, start of the 1900s, there was a rich black landowner named Ottaway Gurley. And he took advantage of a petroleum oil boom in Oklahoma, and he bought 40 acres worth of land in the city of Tulsa. And he sold and rented that land to other freed slaves and descendants of freed slaves. And over the start of the 1900s, Black Wall Street, or the Greenwood District, was born. Basically, money was borrowed and given to black entrepreneurs, leading to many black-owned and operated businesses that directly catered to other freed slaves. In less than 20 years of development, the Greenwood District in Tulsa grew to over 10,000 residents. And by collecting together and supporting each other in the district, people there had a greater standard of living than most black people alive in America at that time.
Black Wall Street is in many ways a misnomer, because what the business community in the Greenwood District, the black community in Tulsa, was like, was more like, would be a black Main Street. So these were not, banking enterprises and investment enterprises. These were mostly small businesses. So there were movie theaters and dance halls and barber shops and grocery stores and restaurants and service providers like doctors and lawyers and pharmacists and dentists. These are relatively well-off black folks who contributed to the economic fortunes of places like the Greenwood District, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, like the successful black business community in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and like the successful small all-black towns that dotted Oklahoma during this period. The conditions were particularly oppressive in the Deep South, in places like Alabama, Mississippi. So there were people who came to Oklahoma during the land openings beginning in 1889, African-American people who recruited black folks to come from the Deep South to Oklahoma, really with the idea that they could get a fair shake in Oklahoma. A number of notable figures dotted the Greenwood District in its early heyday. O.W. Gurley is considered the father of the Greenwood District. He's a relatively wealthy black man from Arkansas who came to Oklahoma in the land run in 1889, ended up in Tulsa. 1906, he started his first business. He owned the Gurley Hotel and had a grocery store as well. He also bought land and sold it to other black folks in the community at that time. So in some senses, he helped populate the district. So for those reasons, he's considered the founder and the father of the district. Black Wall Street, the Greenwood District, was also a community of necessity. There wouldn't have been a need for a separate black economic island in Tulsa had it not been for Jim Crow segregation. So black people were not able to participate fully in the mainstream economy dominated by white Tulsans. So they created their own economy. This community thrived up until the first devastation, which was the Massacre.
And Greenwood was prolific. They had a 750-seat Dreamland Theater for plays and musicals. They had their own newspaper called the Tulsa Star. They had a Masonic lodge, several grocery stores, a 54-room hotel, casinos, bars, cafes, and restaurants of many kinds, tailor shops, private schools, donut shops. They had a fully operating hospital, a public library. In total, Greenwood was 35 square city blocks, containing about 1,500 homes, a couple hundred businesses, and over 10,000 residents. That is where the main bulk of our story will take place today, but enter the main people in our story. Dick Rowland, mostly reported as a 16-year-old black shoeshine. Now, I say mostly reported because a lot of records from this time were either lost or obscured. Some people think purposefully. People of Tulsa, and especially like the white people that survived this, they wanted to cover up this event. They didn't want the world to know what happened there. So there was a lot of obscuring of history. So that's why we don't really know how old Dick was and how old the other people in the story was and just how many people actually died. Dick was a 16-year-old shoeshine who had a job shining shoes in the white part of downtown Tulsa. Now, he was in the Drexler building because that was one of the only buildings in downtown Tulsa where black people were allowed to use a restroom. So he was taking the elevator to the top floor of the Drexler building to use one of the only restrooms that was available to him. And that's where he ran into Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white elevator operator who was also working in the Drexel building. Some reports say that she was an orphan trying to make a living for herself, but again, records are very scarce. Now, they encountered each other in an elevator. There are rumors, unconfirmed, the two may have been seeing each other, and this whole event was an argument between lovers. But that's mostly unconfirmed. The sequence of events that most people agree on, including eventually the police, are this. May 30th, 1921, in Tulsa. Dick Rowland enters the Drexel building intending to go to the bathroom and trips on his way into the elevator. Now, this was an old building with a shitty elevator, so apparently the elevator stopped in between floors unevenly, so you either had to step up or step down to get into it. And apparently he stumbled and slipped and grabbed onto Sarah's arm on the way down. That's all it took for her to scream and yell in surprise, and Dick took off running. But her screaming about her arm being grabbed attracted the attention of some nearby people and eventually a police officer. And she gave Rowland's description and her retelling of the event to the police. And the only thing we know about her account was that she said, quote-unquote, "I was attacked." We don't know anything beyond that. The next day, on May 31st, Rowland was arrested and brought for questioning by the Tulsa police. On the day of the riot, Sarah leaves town. And while she was gone, she writes to the district attorney asking him to drop all charges on Rowland. And after the events of the massacre, after the police actually finished their investigation, they also conclude that a quote-unquote attack didn't happen. Dick just slipped, grabbed her arm on the way down, and that was the whole event. That's what most people agree on. But that's not what was put in the paper. And what was put in the paper is argued today to be the spark point that created this whole disaster.
The headline, it says, "Nabbed Negro for attacking girl in elevator."
Yeah, and remember this is 1921, so it's going to have some 1921 language in it.
Yeah, so it says, a Negro delivery boy who gave his name to the police as Diamond Dick, but who has been identified as Dick Rowland, was arrested on South Greenwood Avenue this morning by officers Carmichael and Pack, charged with attempting to assault the 17-year-old white elevator girl in the Drexel building early yesterday. He will be tried in municipal court this afternoon on a state charge. The girl said she noticed the Negro a few minutes before the attempted assault looking up and down the hallway on the third floor of the Drexel building as if to see if there was anyone in sight, but thought nothing of it at the time. A few minutes later, he entered the elevator, she claimed, and attacked her, scratching her hands and face and tearing her clothes. Her screams brought a clerk from Renberg's store to her assistant, and the Negro fled. He was captured and identified this morning by both by the girl and clerk, police say. Rowland denied that he tried to harm the girl, but admitted he put his hand on her arm in the elevator when she was alone. Tenants of the Drexel building said the girl is an orphan who works as an elevator operator to pay her way through business college.
Now, a lot of what was mentioned in that article is stuff that the police wouldn't have given up yet. They wouldn't have provided that information. So a lot of what that was in that article was just speculation by the journalist that wrote it. They speculated that he looked up and down the hall. They speculated that her clothes got ripped. The only thing that the public knew was that this white girl claimed she got attacked. And this newspaper outright said that, yes, an assault happened. Yes, he was pursuing her. They kind of demonized him in the press. And furthermore, they demonized him to an audience of racist readers. There was a report that an additional editorial was written in the paper on the exact same day, saying that people should lynch the, quote, trouble-causing Negro. But mysteriously, before the newspaper clippings could be properly stored and made into microphages, that editorial was cut out of the Tulsa newspaper. Yeah, there's some evidence of, deliberate cover-ups, especially with what happens later on.
As an educator, does it frustrate you to see how many people don't know about the Tulsa Race Massacre?
Absolutely. It was not something that come up in the curriculum. It may be something now in the curriculum, but it's probably a real short chapter.
I learned about it through work. When I learned about it, I was embarrassed that I didn't know about it.
Exactly.
Then the more that I learned, I was shocked to find out that most people didn't know about it. I've been in Oklahoma for about 6 years now.
You had generations grow up in this city who never heard about it. I didn't hear about it until I was in my mid-20s. And now there's been more written about and reported on this event in the last 5 years than there were in the previous 95 years combined.
Once it gets spread outside the community, then it's going to be too hard to keep it down, too hard to suppress, and then you got to deal with it.
There's a push by the library system and others in the community to incorporate this into the curriculum, to get education kits out to teachers that may be struggling with how to teach the massacre, especially to younger kids.
We should know our history, and Black history is history in general. I think it's important also for young Black children to know that they stand on the backs of people who were incredible.
They built up a city that was Wakanda before Wakanda.
With it being the 100-year anniversary, I feel like there are a lot of people who are interested in supporting the things that are happening here, and it's awesome to be sharing this history, and everybody needs to know.
What happened in the race massacre is that civil order completely broke down and was overwhelmed by hatred, and people lost their homes and their lives as a result of that. And that is absolutely something that can still happen today.
But within hours of that article going out, a bunch of white people began to gather at the courthouse where Roland was being held, and began demanding the sheriff release Roland to the people of Tulsa's custody so he could be properly lynched and punished. Now, that was on May 30th. So 4 p.m. May 30th, same day, Tulsa Police Commissioner J.M. Atkinson receives an anonymous phone call saying, "We are going to lynch that Negro black devil that assaulted that girl," quoting a lot of the article verbatim. The police commissioner and the police sheriff started coordinating, and they had many factors to take into account. So they had a crowd of angry white people outside the courthouse demanding that they give up Dick. So they had these things to take into account. So extrajudicial killings in the name of vigilante justice were fairly common, and events of police handing black people over to crowds to be lynched were not rare. Lynching had become, quote-unquote, the go-to option when racist white people wanted to, quote-unquote, take back the dignity of a white woman who they thought had been assaulted. And there's lots of different cases throughout history of them taking black people out of the hands of police and killing them. And later on, them finding out that that person didn't do anything to anybody. Emmett Till comes to mind. The second factor they had to weigh was that several police officers had been fired for handing over black detainees to mobs, but just as many faced no real punishment for their actions. So there'd been a history of some sheriffs losing their job for doing that, and some not even being punished for that. And the third option they had to weigh is that they knew not allowing the crowd to have Roland may result in the white people rioting and looting. It happened in Atlanta in 1905, in Springfield in 1908, and there have been lots of examples of when you don't give the mob what they want, which is to murder this person in custody. They will riot and destroy things. So the sheriff had three choices. 1, hand Roland over, face possible job loss and conviction, but possibly avoid a riot and gain the trust of the mob. Number 2, he could keep Roland in the courthouse, risk the mob breaking into the courthouse and or rioting if they can't get to Roland, and he would have to just deal with the further destruction that would follow. Number 3, he would move Roland and risk him being captured while he's being transported. So they went with option 2. They were going to hold Roland in the courthouse and try and defend him as best they can and ride out the white mob that wanted him. So 5 p.m. May 31st, hundreds of white people were gathered outside the courthouse, and by this time, the sheriff had put Roland on an upper floor of the courthouse, had shut down the only elevator to get to that floor, and put several of his deputies up on that floor with instructions that say, if anybody but me comes up here, shoot them. And he was basically going to try and ride out the riot in the courthouse. So a large part of the white mob left for about an hour, and they made a trip to a nearby National Guard armory. And they attempted to break into it and take the weapons within, but the mob was unable to overcome the heavily fortified armory and the armed guards guarding it. So by the time the white mob came back to the courthouse after they tried to rob the armory of their weapons, about 25 black veterans of World War I had shown up. They had heard what was going on. They were afraid that the police were just going to give up Roland as well, so they showed up and tried to defend and tried to help out the sheriff. The sheriff turned them away, saying he didn't need their help. And for several hours, the crowd and the police argued back and forth. The tensions and anger were growing, and calls for the police to give up the black teen were growing. A lot of people in the Greenwood District were getting word of how bad it was getting, and even more veterans were sent down with weapons to try and defend them. And several times, these line of veterans would get in between the courthouse and the white mob that was trying to break in. At about 10 p.m., the crowd of white people had grown to about 2,000 in number outside the courthouse, and they were becoming a bigger and bigger problem for the police and the black veterans that are trying to hold them back. And at 10 p.m., all hell broke loose.
At about 9 o'clock, a group of African-American World War I vets, all of whom are armed with pistols, rifles, shotguns, many of them have put on their Army uniforms, march up to the front steps of the courthouse, and they approach Sheriff McCullough, and they say, Sheriff, we are here to help defend the prisoner.
They were told, don't worry, he will not be lynched, and no one's going to take him. He's going to be safe here.
And the men leave. But the effect that the vets had on the white lynch mob is just transformative.
Upon seeing this group of black men who have come downtown, boldly holding their weapons, in this very manly, courageous way, it electrifies the whites.
They go nuts. Members of the mob run home to get their own guns.
And not only came back with weapons, brought others with them.
The mob is getting bigger, 600, 700, 800 people, armed, angry.
20 minutes, 30 minutes later, a larger group of black men return to downtown.
But they know that a black person is about to be murdered by a lynching in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they are not going to let that happen.
By this time, the crowd has grown to nearly 2,000, if not more.
A former county investigator named E.S. McQueen confronted a black man named Johnny Cole in front of the courthouse. McQueen attempted to disarm Cole, and after they wrestled over Cole's gun, the gun discharged. That discharge didn't hit anybody, but that gunshot was the moment that people began to go from yelling at each other to fighting each other, either shooting each other or beating each other, or basically trying to overtake this line of people to get into the courthouse. The crowd scattered and began to fight, and the sheriff gave up trying to defend the courthouse. He thought that his deputies had it, and he took off for cover in a nearby hotel. Walter Daggs, a white man, was hit by a bullet and killed. Homer Klein was hit by a bullet and killed. And an unidentified black person was chased down a back alley and murdered. And a lot of these deaths are going to be unconfirmed people because a lot of records weren't kept. The crowd was earlier denied weapons from the National Guard, so as this tension grew and as they actually started rioting and looting, they broke into a nearby sporting goods store and took all the guns and ammunition and anything else that could be used to start a fire, and they started to equip themselves. Now, a lot of these people were just part of the white mob, but at this point there were a lot of police officers both in and out of uniform that were guiding and helping them. Some police officers were trying to hold the crowd back, and some were working and being compliant right with them, almost like it was a regular course of action.
That's fucked up.
Oh, yeah. Over the next 3 hours, the white mob began looting downtown, while other parts of it continued to try and break into the barricaded courthouse. They were unsuccessful in breaking into the courthouse, but they looted a lot of downtown Tulsa. That's when the National Guard is called in, consisting of 65 men. And the police commissioner started making regular citizens, so regular people of Tulsa, what he called special deputies, and gave them temporary powers of an officer. And he said that he commissioned 400 men that night to be that.
Holy shit, just like pulling them out of bars or what?
Yeah, like he was pulling people out of the crowd and whoever he could find, and he was giving them the powers of a police officer.
That's terrifying.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and people who might have been part of this mob moments before, he took the ones that he thought, like, didn't look too, like, mad or too, like, irate, and he made them these special deputies. And the National Guard troops and these special constables fought against the white mob for nearly 2 hours, and also fought against the black people that showed up as well to defend Roland. And basically they had a tug-of-war match where they basically stayed in between the two groups of people as the white people were pushing the black people that showed up back into the Greenwood District. And they thought that was the end of it. They thought that they had gotten through the worst of the fighting. There hasn't been too much bloodshed. Only a few people had died. The white mob seemed satisfied with pushing the veterans back into the Greenwood District. Roland was in the courthouse. Everything seemed fine. But then a rumor mill started up amongst the people of Tulsa. And perhaps stemmed by just paranoia or who knows what, they had it in their minds that there was going to be a black uprising, that the people in the Greenwood District were going to rise up and strike against the white people of Tulsa and murder them.
That's a big jump.
It is. And I tried to look for justifications for this, like where this rumor could come from, where they'd come up with this idea, but I didn't find much. There was apparent plans that one person in Greenwood was contacting some black people in a nearby city to perhaps come over and help, but that's a far cry away from having like an uprising to murder the white people of Tulsa.
Yeah.
But over the course of the night, as the rumor mill kept on swirling and swirling, more and more people became convinced until all the official agencies in Tulsa started basically mobilizing around Greenwood, thinking that it was going to be the center of this uprising and they had to stop it before it started. And the paranoia went so far that the police sheriff, his force is already being stretched thin from dealing with the mob. He thought that he should stretch them even thinner. He sent some of them to the power plant, some of them to the water treatment plant, some of them to the mayor's house, because he thought an uprising is going to happen at any minute and have to protect all these areas from the uprising. At this point, there was National Guardsmen, there were ex-servicemen, white veterans that came. There was police officers, there was all those special constables, the hundreds of them. And they were surrounding Greenwood in battle lines. Basically, anybody that was a special constable or uniformed was in the first rank of the battle line, and this big, immense white mob was behind them. Basically, they kept on gathering supplies and planning how they were going to invade Greenwood up until the morning light broke. So at 5:30 a.m., the National Guard, the police, and official Tulsa authorities, including chiefs, commissioners, and military officers, were all operating under the false assumption that the rumor that a black uprising in Greenwood was true. And they thought that the way to deal with it was to invade Greenwood and arrest all the citizens within, armed or unarmed.
Jesus Christ.
Yep. And this is where Mary E. Jones comes in.
Well, that was me.
Yeah, she's a journalist that was alive in the time, and she has been known to have written the most detailed accounts of what happened in this time.
All night long, they could be heard firing from both sides, while the whites were marshaling more than 5,000 men who had surrounded the Negro section to make an early attack in the morning on more than 8,000 innocent Negroes. I don't like saying that word.
Eventually, the military, the ex-military, the special deputies, and the police arrived on Greenwood's doorstep, and they started arresting people en masse. Now, I won't say that the military, the special deputies, the police were peaceful, but they were more peaceful than the wave that came after. The arrests that the uniformed people were doing were, I guess, more peaceful. They were more structured. They were less chaotic. People were still being beaten. People were still having guns pointed at. People were still being threatened, but it wasn't outright chaos. And basically what they were doing is they were subduing people. They didn't have enough handcuffs for everybody, so they were just getting thousands of citizens at gunpoint to put their hands over their head and to basically form lines and march themselves down under arrest to a holding area in downtown Tulsa. And when these forces started invading Tulsa, that's how they were transporting people down. And these people had done nothing. They were victims of a false rumor that there was some uprising happening. And women, children, innocent people just trying to go about their day were being arrested en masse. And any resistance was met with beatings. The unorganized white mob was inching up towards the border of Greenwood. The already stretched thin police force and military did not have enough people to hold back the crowd. Some eyewitness reports say that as little as 10 to 30 men were holding back a mob of about 3,000 people. And it's just not enough to hold it back. And eventually, at one point, anger boiled over, and the mob broke through and entered Greenwood. And many of those in Greenwood were former slaves, or direct descendants of slaves. They were very resistant to violent white men attempting to restrain them. So many of them resisted being captured, like I think many of us would.
Oh, for sure.
The soldiers and the police would also beat them when they resisted, but members of the white mob went way further. They were setting people on fire. They were murdering them. They were shooting them down. There was lots of accounts like that. And as the chaos went on, a lot of people that were uniformed kind of took the mob entering Greenwood as an excuse to become less professional themselves. And many of them were as violent as any members of the mob. Like, just because they were a policeman in uniform, they were taking part in the murder of innocent people right beside everybody else.
The community was soon overwhelmed because the white vigilantes, who were better armed, quickly outnumbered them. Also, heavily armed, angry white mobs from neighboring cities, as well as the police, joined these white attackers. These animals in human skin who hunt others for enjoyment put up a machine gun and directed it into a church where they knew people had gone to take refuge. Some rode around the city in cars, firing through windows of houses. They went into homes and dragged men out to shoot on the streets, or dragged them tied to the back of cars around for display through the city.
My mother was with her family, 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. All of us were in the house. When we saw coming up the walk in the front of the house off of Easton Street, 4 men with torches in their hands. These torches were burning. When my mother saw them coming, she says, "You get up under the bed, get up under the bed, get up under the bed." And all 4 of us got up under the bed. I was the last one, and my sister grabbed me and pulled me under there. And while I was under the bed, one of the guys coming past the bed stepped on my finger, and as I was about to scream, my sister put her hand over my mouth so I couldn't be heard. Now, I remember that.
I was asleep when my mother awakened me, and she told me to get up and so she could dress me. She says, Doris, get up so I can have you dressed. The white folks are killing the colored folks. And I thought, when she said that, I jumped up and I thought that we were just being lined up in ambush like that. But anyway, in looking out the door, I could see nothing but black rolling smoke.
Firefighters were met by the armed mob who prevented them from putting out the flames. First-hand accounts say as many as 6 airplanes were firing rifles and dropping dynamite and firebombs on buildings, homes, and fleeing African Americans.
When we left our house, I was so afraid because bullets were coming down around us. The planes were up in the air, shooting down, and I could hear those bullets falling.
It's highly likely that somebody in one of the airplanes, at least one of them, strafed the community with bullets. And eyewitnesses say that some sort of bombs or incendiary devices were dropped on the community that caused the fires to burn more quickly and more brilliantly.
So you had 40 square blocks just not reduced into billows of smoke, ash, mortar, no more, just shells of their former selves. And so you had people who were shot and laid where they fell, right there on the streets of Greenwood.
It was 1920 who? 1920 what? 1920 when? 1920 where? 1920 why? Flames lick the sky. Moans fill the air. Hopes in ashes lie, buried on the vacant stairs. It was rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, assaulted from the front as suddenly there were flames in Little Africa as white anger burst upon Greenwood. Gunfire and screams, plane fire destroying dreams as they roiled through homes in waves like plagues of locusts. The white mob surged hungrily northward, urged by a primal hatred, seeking to feast on the futures of Black Wall Street.
My grandfather said we were going out of town, and he, the white man, said, "Not this day, you're not going out of town." Bam, the interviewer asks. "You saw your grandfather get shot?" "I saw him get shot." Bam, and he was just... My mother let out a scream. "Oh, you've killed my father. You killed him."
Like, the course of action in that time was to be arrested or subdued if you refused to be detained, but... like I said before, like any type of resistance, or sometimes no resistance at all, was just met with murder. A last organized resistance, the people of Greenwood came from several Black World War I armed veterans that were on top in the spire of the Mount Zion Baptist Church. They refused to come out, and they were basically trying to drive away the white mob from the church tower. But the white mob set the church on fire, and some of those veterans escaped, but many of them burned up with the church.
This is George Monroe, Greenwood resident, 5 years old at the time. When my mother saw them coming, she said, "You get up and get under the bed. Get up, get under the bed. Get up and under the bed." And all four of us got up and under the bed. I was the last one, and my sister grabbed me and pulled me under there. And while I was under the bed, one of the guys coming past the bed stepped on my finger, and as I was about to scream, my sister put her hand over my mouth so I couldn't be heard. Now I remember that.
So, as the riot went on, and as the violence escalated and escalated and escalated throughout the morning, a lot of police and military became almost leaders within it. They would provide leadership and structure, but leadership and structure put towards the end of unjustified murder. They would lead groups of the mob from house to house. They would almost systematically go in, strip the house bare, loot it all, beat anyone within and drag them out. They would even have their wives following behind them with bags so that when they were done looting, their wives could go through the house for a second look and put anything they thought they might want to steal in a bag. And then once all the occupants of the house were beaten and subdued, or sometimes worse, murdered, and all their stuff was looted, then the last step for that house was for it to be set on fire and burned to the ground.
It's like fucking pre-Holocaust shit.
Yep, 100%. And like I said, these military and police members acting as leaders, they would lead this mob to systematically, house by house, door by door, go down the street and burn things down.
It's just fascism, eh?
Yeah, 100%.
Fucking fascism.
100%.
You saw that on January 6th, too, the same sort of fucking mentality.
Yeah, that hugely mob mentality.
Oh, and then the cops just kind of letting it happen.
No,
yeah.
stop.
You know?
Yeah, and that's exactly what this is. It's people that don't like the legal system at that time was inadequate anyway. It was causing innocent people to go to jail, and it was victimizing minorities, just like it is today, but worse back then. And even that inadequate, corrupt system wasn't enough for this mob. They wanted to kill him with his bare hands, and since they didn't get that, they cooked up this rumor that gave them an excuse to basically genocide and displace thousands of people.
Yeah.
Many people in Greenwood packed what they could and attempted to escape. Some didn't even have time to do that and attempted to flee the mob instead of surrender. They didn't know whether they would be beaten or tortured or murdered if they surrendered. So many hid. Some ran out of town into surrounding lands. I read some reports that some made it as far as Kansas, just running through the wilderness, becoming just like basically people that were living in the wild for a while because they didn't know if they surrendered to the mob, would I be kept safe or would I be set on fire? There were reports of people being drugged behind trucks and stuff like that, being hung from trees. They didn't know whether that was going to happen to them if they surrendered. They had no real good course of action.
This is Mrs. Mary E. Jones Parrish's eyewitness account. Torchlights were used with gasoline to burn up the Negro settlement, and in the meantime, they used large trucks, loading up pianos, victrolas, and other articles that were in the Negro homes. The whole of the Negro homes were looted by these whites who met no resistance, and most of the Negroes were taken prisoner.
They had trucks, they had moving equipment, they had laborers to help them move big stuff. They had their wives with bags following behind them. They were systematically stripping all the belongings of these people before burning their houses down, arresting them, and taking them downtown.
For no reason.
For no real reason. Based on a rumor that all the official authorities in Tulsa decided to believe.
This is Eldoris, a 9-year-old resident of Greenwood. When we left our house, I was so afraid because the bullets were coming down around us. The planes were up in the air, shooting down, and I could hear those bullets falling. And all of a sudden, when we got to the tracks, I went over to the track and there was a lot of people running, dodging the bullets and just afraid. So I ran into this chicken coop, an empty one, I guess, but people just filled it up. I ran in with them and got in the corner, and I was just afraid to death. My father had to come in and get me.
Yeah, many people just ran and hid where they could. Some people found some sympathetic white families that would hide them until the chaos was over. Like it very much rings of like attacks on Jewish settlements, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Like people had to hide in order to avoid the violence.
Yeah.
Did I hear that right? They were being strafed by aircraft.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. 6 aircraft, J-94 two-seater biplanes were commissioned from the airport by the police. Local authorities to this day insist the planes were simply used for reconnaissance purposes, but many witnesses, including our journalist Mary, report having seen several flaming balls of turpentine being dropped from one of the planes. Now, the argument against that is that these planes were unwieldy, they're not really that good to drop some from. It would be complicated to, like, build a turpentine bomb and drop it, but people who have gone back have said that, the city of Tulsa is plenty capable of having somebody who would have that kind of knowledge to construct these things. It would have been difficult, but not impossible for somebody to make like a very crude turpentine bomb and to drop it on things. And many of the accounts that were captured, many of the eyewitnesses' accounts, kind of show that they were unwieldy because they describe like fire being tossed every which place, some of it landing on houses, some of it not. So like it kind of fits the description. Just like turpentine being lit on fire and then dumped out of planes.
All right, this is from Mrs. Mary E. Jones Parrish again. At the signal of a whistle, more than a dozen aeroplanes went up and began to drop turpentine balls upon the Negro residences, while 5,000 whites with machine guns and other deadly weapons began firing in all directions.
Yeah, and you heard that correctly. The National Guard that was stationed in Tulsa wasn't huge. It only had 65 members, but what it did have was an artillery department that had several machine guns in tow, and they let Tulsa citizens, sometimes regular citizens, shoot these machine guns into the crowds of people. For hours, black people were forced out of their homes, beaten and often shot, arrested, detained, and then their homes were looted of all valuable belongings and then burned to the ground. In the end, over 1,256 homes and 91 businesses were looted and burned to the ground. Of all the structures within the Greenwood District, only 215 houses out of 1,200, 2 churches, and 1 high school remained after the massacre.
Holy shit.
Everything else was burnt to the ground.
Yeah, looted and burned.
Archaeologists have made a startling discovery, a mass grave in Tulsa, what they believe to be the remains of victims of the 1921 race massacre there. At least 12 bodies in a spot the city had no record of anyone buried. Nearly a century ago, a white mob attacked and wiped out the area in Tulsa known as Black Wall Street. Experts estimate the mob killed as many as 300 African Americans and wounded some 800 more. How is the city of Tulsa coming to grips with this?
This is an incredible moment for the Tulsa community, one that's acknowledged by Mayor G.T. Bynum today.
I'm thankful for the citizens of Tulsa who have reversed nearly a century of the conventional wisdom of this being something that we don't want to talk about and that we just want to put behind us and pretend like it never happened. This generation of Tulsans is not doing that.
Mayor Bynum visited this site yesterday, and today he's not the only one. Crowds have gathered all week here at Oaklawn Cemetery to watch the work being done here. Some say they're even surprised that the investigation has come to this point where they're actually digging up soil in search of the victims of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Descendants have even stopped by. One of them tells me he didn't know his family was impacted by the attack until later in life, and that's because his family, he says, was so traumatized by what happened, they didn't want to talk about it.
Carrie is an archaeologist at the University of Oklahoma working on the excavation and with us live. Thank you so much. How stunned were people to find that this was there and no one had any clue?
Well, so I think absolutely it's definitely come as a surprise. It is not unusual to encounter unmarked graves in a cemetery, especially a historic cemetery, but certainly to have encountered this number of unmarked graves in the large trench that we've excavated is quite surprising, yes.
Carrie, you were just in a meeting, I understand, with descendants of the massacre victims. What did they say about this dig?
They have questions for us. They're clearly very interested. I think they're quite pleased with the fact that we have made this step and that we're making progress. But understandably, everybody is starting to ask questions about the next steps and where do we go from here.
What are the next steps? I mean, are they planning on exhuming the bodies or what?
That is, the next step is what we are going to propose is that exhumation would be the appropriate thing for us to do, maintain the preservation of those remains while we undertake the analyses, the specialized analyses that will allow us to confirm if, in fact, we are looking at race massacre victims.
Well, is there an idea about whether people will ever be identified? Is there a process that's reliable all these years later?
There is a process. So DNA is available as one technique to try and identify
if there's a match from way back then.
Obtaining the samples from the skeletal remains is somewhat easier. Doesn't mean that it isn't itself complicated, but that is quite a bit easier than the other end of that, which is to then identify an individual who would provide a sample that can be identified as a match to our skeletal remains, especially when we're talking about multiple generations on.
Sure.
This is from Mrs. Mary E. Jones Parish again. The number of whites and Negroes killed in this raid will never be known. Several Negroes were tied to the backs of automobiles and dragged through the streets while bullets were being fired into their bodies. Women were being chased from their homes and volleys of shots fired at them as they were fleeing, some with babies in their arms. These things, and many others which are not mentioned, were done in America, which makes its boast of true democracy. O America, cruel America, thou art weighed in the balance.
The true death toll of Tulsa will never be fully known. The reported deaths are only the deaths that were from people that were recovered. 1 recovered, 2 claimed, and then 3 issued a proper death certificate. The actual death toll is far higher than what was reported. For both sides, but mostly for the black people of the Greenwood District. Yeah, there was only 37 deaths reported. 26 of those being black people and 10 being white people. But there were so many reports from direct eyewitnesses of people being gunned down, burned alive, hung from trees, beaten to death, drugged behind vehicles. All in all, most historians agree the number of white dead is probably more around 50, and the number of black murdered people is likely in the hundreds, and some estimates as high as 900 people dead.
Holy.
Yeah. And there were reports of charred black corpses being loaded into trucks like stalking cordwood in a logging truck.
Blech.
And having them dumped down mine shafts and into rivers and buried in mass graves.
Fuck.
All under the table. No paperwork of this exists. But there was reports of all these bodies, way more than 26, being moved. There's a lot of controversy that surrounds this final number. And there's a lot of evidence that a lot of reports at the time, either like paperwork or forms that had to be filled out or pay stubs that had to be paid out to people that were paid to move the bodies, a lot of those records have been conveniently lost through the years, where there is no real proof as to how many people could have actually died. And many historians agree that a deliberate cover-up happened somewhere in history. The event ended mostly when the National Guard showed up at around 11 a.m. So from 6 a.m. to 11, it was just pure murder and chaos and Greenwood burning to the ground. The National Guard arrived, basically got the white mob to go back home, and arrested the rest of the black people that were standing amongst the charred remains. Many were held in detention until a white person vouched for them, or until they were determined not to be dangerous. But many of these people were permanently detained, meaning that a lot of them were put back into labor camps. Some of them had just escaped slavery, and now, because of no real reason, they were put back into basically another form of slavery, being locked up and forced to do labor. Some of the only people that were charged and indicted at the time were some of the black veterans that showed up to originally defend Roland. They were said they were to blame for inciting the white crowd, and that led to the riot. So just some direct victim blamey bullshit, saying that like these black people that came to defend Roland, it's their fault that the white crowd burned down the Greenwood District
Because they were very nervous.
There were a couple white people that got charged with murder, like the very overt ones that like drug people behind their trucks and all that. But for the most part, most of the charges that were given out were for like vandalism, petty theft, slaps on wrists. The significant charges were handed out to the black people of Greenwood, and really no real justice has been had.
One of the things that happened after the massacre was a commitment on the part of black Tulsans to rebuild the community. They were aided by groups like the NAACP in New York City who sent contributions here. They faced a lot of barriers to the rebuilding from the city commission, from the Chamber of Commerce, from the mayor himself, T.D. Evans. Part of what happened as a result of the massacre is this gulf of distrust. Even when we open things up more generally, the power and the privilege still resided in the dominant culture, or in white people. We have change in the ownership of land in this community. We didn't strike a balance when we did the integration process. It was more of a desegregation process, which means we bring these two races together, we desegregate them. But integration means this: there's equity in the mix, not just throwing people together. So because black people couldn't engage with the larger economy, they had to engage with one another in a cooperative, collaborative way and support one another financially. So they were so intent on rebuilding the community that they did it to an extent that the community exceeded what it had been prior to its destruction, peaking in the 1940s. So the question arises as to whether or not going to court over something is a viable strategy in terms of this notion of reparations. This discussion really came about in the early 2000s when there was a lawsuit filed seeking reparations for some of the survivors. And reparations was really defined as cash payments to living individuals who were survivors, who were alive during the the massacre. And the litigation was halted because of what's called statute of limitations, meaning that the claims, according to the court, should have been brought earlier, and because they weren't, they were barred. They couldn't go forward. Litigation, by definition, creates an adversarial relationship. It creates one side versus the other side. So if the end is what's best for the community going forward, then litigation may not be the best strategy, even if we decide that cash payments to particular individuals are warranted. The state needs to be involved. Elected leaders need to be involved. Maybe the legislative process is the best route because it's a process that by definition leads more to collegiality. But if I were going to emphasize involvement, I would stress to individuals that individuals need to be involved. What is the route most likely to achieve our ultimate aim?
There's been some events throughout history in 2004, 2008 of like Tulsa like half-ass apologizing and saying they would give reparations but then not. And really the full story of this hasn't been uncovered. A full apology hasn't been had. And a real investigation really hasn't been opened.
That is surprisingly unsurprising. Sorry, that is sadly unsurprising.
Oh, 100%. And just to give you an idea of the scale of the damage, we already said 900 lives lost, 900 people estimated dead. In terms of the property that was lost, and remember, this is stuff that was scraped together from people who were just like freed from bondage just 40 years before this. It was a value loss of around $2 million in 1921, or about $30 million today. And about 36 square city blocks were burned to the ground. Most Greenwood families lived in tents and rubble. Loved ones were either jailed, missing, or dead. Eventually, the community rebuilt. The people of the Greenwood District were headstrong and passionate and driven. They didn't want to give up, so they rebuilt Greenwood, even from the ashes. And it came into kind of like a second renaissance in 1946. And with cover-up efforts, a lot of people who live in Tulsa today, even a lot of black people who live in Tulsa today, like, didn't find out about the massacre until late in their lives. Like, knowledge of this event and it being brought up in recent pop culture has been kind of a recent thing. Like, it hasn't really been talked about through the years. It's just been this kind of thing that's been swept under the rug. Yeah, Tulsa and society in general today tried to make people forget about the massacre. Forget about the fury that a racist crowd can implement on a community of those they dislike. It shows the capacity for a discriminatory community to avoid learning lessons from its past and instead put energy into making people forget the event ever happened. So they never really made any reparations or apologies. They just wanted to cover it up. These racial tensions still exist today, and although they are not as overtly shown, there are still droves of evidence under the right circumstances that with unaddressed racial hatred existing just under the surface of many people, that the destruction of Black Wall Street could easily happen again today under the right circumstances. And that's what I want to leave it off on. Like, I'm talking about this event from 1921, and I'm seeing a lot of similarities to situations and contexts and attitudes that exist today. And I think that kind of fury against someone that's different from you, leading to mass death and tragedy, could easily happen again, and I think it has happened again in recent history. I guess that's all I got on the destruction of Black Wall Street. Did anybody have anything to say?
That's fucking miserable, man.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it would be a happy episode.
Well, the Tulsa Massacre.
Yeah, but I mean, some massacres are fun.
Like when I'm massacring some tacos? Or...
Yeah.
I thought you were going to make a Hutus and Tutsis joke, but
oh no.
Those don't pan out well.
Mm-mm. Yeah, kind of a sobering episode.
Speaking of sobering, all of y'all ate some edibles before we started this episode, and I want to know how they're going for you.
10 out of 10, but I'm really hungry.
I'm feeling pretty docile.
I'd say 9 out of 10. I'm feeling pretty good, but still functionable.
Yeah, I'm feeling tingly.
9 out of 10. I just remembered how to use my mouth just now, so this is pretty exciting.
Welcome back.
Hey, hello.
Yeah.
He's still here.
I'm glad that I could continue reading. That was good.
10 out of 10 for reading out of your one squint eye.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fuck the police.
Yeah. Yeah, ACAB, fuck the police.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to go on. For Occulte Veritatis, I've been with Gallifrey.
Thanks, Mary.
Leon Filger.
Richard Bigley.
Fuck the police, I'm the soundboard demon.
Don Kessler.
And I'm Tori.
Bye-bye.
Love you, bye.
Playing us out this episode, a song released in the same year that our episode story took place. This is I Found a Rose in the Devil's Garden from the Sterling Trio, back in 1921. Enjoy, and see you in the after show.
Lost in a city that has no pity, I found a road, little lonesome road, where smiling faces, high broken hearts, in happy places, where sorrow starts. I found a rose in the devil's garden, wandering alone, little lonesome road. For her the sun is never shining, for her the clouds have no silver lining. I found the rose in the devil's garden, playing the game of the moth and flame. Beneath the powder and paint, maybe the heart of the flame, where sorrow grows. I found a I found the rose in the devil's garden, playing the game of the moth and flame. Beneath the powder and paint, maybe the heart of the same, where sorrow grows. I found
Hello, occultists, and welcome to the after show. My name is Leon Filger, and holy flying fuck, have I got some good news. The James Webb Space Telescope has passed its first assignment with flying colors after it handed a spectacular photo to NASA. This took place on Wednesday, the 16th of March. The James Webb Space Telescope, as we've discussed in the Space Telescopes episode, has got a primary mirror that's made up of an array of 18 individual mirrors that, once they're properly aligned, will act as a single mirror. And last Wednesday, that's exactly what happened. All the mirrors are working, all their little servos and actuators did their thing, and the James Webb Space Telescope is now focused on star 2MASS J17554042 655-1277. That's a mouthful, but this image is incredible. Definitely Google it.
We got together and looked at the very first diffraction-limited images that came out of the Webb telescope. And what we collectively saw as a group is we have the highest resolution infrared images taken from space ever. So you think of it as a blob on a picture, but it is extremely high resolution. We have exceeded every expectation. The telescope has performed better than the models said it should. We've even achieved, we talk about resolution and wavefront quality. We've done better in those regards than we thought we would do, and we're just thrilled to death. And to get there, we went through a process. Well, we did the segment identification, and then we formed the image array. And then once they were in the image array, we used this phase retrieval technology to position each of the mirror segments and the secondary mirror itself such that all the optical aberrations were effectively eliminated. So there's only one thing left to do, and that's to see how well the telescope is aligned in the other science instruments. And we'll check the alignment there, and if necessary, then we'll apply a solution that optimizes for the entire telescope. We then periodically measure the alignment of the telescope and make corrections as necessary. I cannot wait to see what it discovers.
Interestingly enough, the James Webb Space Telescope is so powerful that if it were on the surface of the Earth, it could detect the heat signature from a honeybee on the moon. This thing is tight as shit, and it is going to be seeing some incredible things, peering into the deepest, darkest corners of our universe and looking where we all came from. For the after show, I've been Leon Filger. Enjoy your night, or evening, or afternoon, or day, but you should be listening to this podcast 24 hours a day. There's episodes you haven't heard. Go back into our library, especially the space ones with Leon Filger. They're going to be fantastic. G'day.